Do you also believe that a Formula One team should protect its drivers at all costs? So how is it possible that McLaren remained silent when Oscar Piastri was heavily penalized in Brazil? Guenther Steiner, known for not keeping anything quiet, called them directly wankers. Today we're going to find out why this former team boss lost his mind and what this means for the future of McLaren. Stick around, because what you're about to hear may change your perception of one of F1's most beloved teams. Everything exploded in Interlagos. The 2025 Brazilian Grand Prix was the scene of one of the most heated controversies of the year, and not precisely because of the fight for victory, but because of a sanction that touched very sensitive fibers within the paddock. Oscar Piastri, McLaren driver, was penalized 10 seconds for an incident in Turn 1, after the safety car came out on lap 6. The context was tense. All the drivers were grouped together, trying to gain positions in a restart that promised chaos. At that moment, Piastri found a gap on the inside and launched himself to overtake Kimi Antonelli, while Charles Leclerc tried something similar on the outside. The maneuver did not go well. There was contact between Piastri and Antonelli, and the latter was thrown at Leclerc, breaking the Ferrari's suspension. The result: immediate abandonment for the Monegasque. The FIA did not hesitate in its verdict. It determined that Piastri was fully responsible for the incident, arguing that he did not comply with inside passing guidelines. According to the stewards, its front axle was not at the height of the mirror of Antonelli's car at the apex of the corner, as required by the updated FIA regulations in 2025 for a driver to have the right to space. This technicality was enough to sanction the Australian with a 10-second penalty and 2 points on his super license. A decision that unleashed the fury of many, but especially that of a man who no longer has filters, Guenther Steiner. Steiner, former Haas team principal and current media figure, exploded on the Red Flags podcast and took direct aim at McLaren. But his anger was not only against the penalty itself, but also against the reaction, or rather the lack of reaction, of the British team. In his raw style, without euphemisms, he declared that McLaren was his wanker of the weekend. Beyond the insult, the substance of the message was much deeper. For Steiner, what was truly unacceptable was that McLaren did absolutely nothing to defend its driver. And that is where his criticism gains weight. In such a close championship, every second, every penalty, every point in the super license counts. But even more important is what these types of situations say about the internal dynamics of a team. Steiner does not understand how, in an environment where teams tend to constantly pressure stewards, using every tool at their disposal to reverse unfavorable decisions, McLaren has remained silent. Not a formal protest. Not a public statement. Not an attempt at appeal. Absolute silence. For someone like Steiner, who became famous precisely for his outbursts and for fighting every point until the end with a modest team like Haas, this passive attitude was an act of betrayal of the sport's own competitive spirit. And the most compelling point Steiner makes is not an assumption. It is a testimony. Charles Leclerc, the direct victim of the incident, stated that he did not see Piastri as the only person responsible. For him, it was a career move, a 50-50 between the Australian's optimism and the aggressive line that Antonelli took. A moderate and objective analysis of the driver who, ironically, was left out of the race. That testimony could have been gold in the hands of McLaren. But they never took advantage of it. They did not build any public argument with it. And that, for Steiner, was the biggest fault. The message between the lines was brutal. If the affected person himself does not completely blame Piastri, why does his team do so by standing by? For Steiner, these types of attitudes weaken the perception that stewards have about a team and its drivers. Because in Formula One you don't only compete on the track. A constant battle is also waged in the field of politics, psychology, and institutional pressure. And McLaren in this case simply didn't show up. Steiner's criticism then becomes a warning. In this sport, if you don't make noise, they ignore you. If you don't defend your driver, you create a narrative of weakness. And what is at stake is not just a sanction. It's respect. It is internal confidence. It is the identity of a team that aspires to return to the top, but that cannot afford to appear fragile when sporting decisions threaten its integrity. McLaren's silence in Brazil was not simply an isolated omission. It was an expression of something deeper, more structural, an internal culture that seems oriented toward diplomacy over conflict. And this, in an environment as aggressive as Formula One, can easily be interpreted as weakness. Guenther Steiner not only criticized the British team's lack of reaction, but contrasted it with the way in which other teams, such as Red Bull or even Ferrari, understand the political game of sport. In his opinion, it's not just about showing support for your drivers. It's about building a reputation, to establish that you are not an easy target for the arbitrary decisions of the commissioners. This is the real battlefield that McLaren seems to have avoided. In modern Formula One, the fight for results is not limited to the stopwatch or aerodynamics. It extends to the briefing rooms, to the post-race statements, to the technical arguments presented to the FIA. It is a war of perceptions. And in that war, silence is a tacit defeat. When Steiner accuses McLaren of being docile, what he is really pointing out is the absence of a culture of strategic confrontation. In teams like Red Bull, Christian Horner has built a public narrative where any penalty or unfavorable interpretation of the regulations is immediately contested. Not necessarily because they are always right, but because they understand that each decision creates precedent. That every time a team accepts a sanction without discussion, it is giving up symbolic ground. You are allowing commissioners to assume that they can apply their judgment without future resistance. Oscar Piastri in this case not only received a sanction, he also carried the implicit message that his team did not consider it appropriate to defend him publicly. Although his maneuver was risky, like many others seen at race restarts, it was by no means a reckless action. And he had the support of one of those directly involved, Charles Leclerc, who did not blame him exclusively. That should have been enough for McLaren to at least ask for a review or show disagreement with the criteria applied. But he didn't do it. This situation also highlights a transformation in the team's identity. McLaren, which in other times was synonymous with struggle, media pressure, and figures with character like Ron Dennis or Martin Whitmarsh, today seems to have adopted a low profile. Andrea Stella, its current director, has prioritized an image of efficiency, serenity, and technique, which has borne sporting fruit, but at the same time could be distancing the team from the political dimension of the championship. And in Formula One, that is as dangerous as having a slow car. Lastly, this internal culture also influences how rivals see you, and how the media talks about you, and how the commissioners themselves internalize your attitude. Because if you never raise your voice, if you never question, if you never demand, the system tends to assume that it can act without fear of retaliation. And in a competition where everything is measured in thousands, not fighting every decision can make the difference between a championship won and one lost. The consequences of what happened at the 2025 Brazilian Grand Prix are not limited to a 10-second penalty or a specific result. The real damage to McLaren is structural and strategic. Because in Formula One, every decision or lack of action leaves its mark. And what is not said also builds a narrative. In this case, the narrative that begins to form around McLaren is that of a team that is brilliant in engineering, but vulnerable on a political, psychological, and emotional management level. Oscar Piastri, a young but already established driver, has shown talent, speed, and a growing ability to assume leading roles in the race. However, what happened in Interlagos leaves a very dangerous signal about its immediate future. The penalty imposed not only affected his result in Brazil, but also increased his points tally in the super license to 6. Let us remember that, according to current regulations, reaching 12 points implies an automatic suspension for one race. That is to say, it is halfway to an extreme penalty, and what is more worrying, it was a punishment that not even his own team made an effort to mitigate or dispute. Guenther Steiner, in his usual direct style, acted as a catalyst for a conversation that many in the paddock wanted to avoid. He clearly pointed out something that had been brewing for a long time. McLaren has built a winning car, has achieved a solid technical structure, has revitalized its brand image. But at the moment of truth, when the scales of sporting justice tilted against it, it chose silence. And that silence can cost them much more than they imagine. Oscar Piastri has proven to be ready to compete at the highest level. His performance in 2024 was proof of this, and in 2025 he started with promising results. But no driver, no matter how talented, can fully develop if he feels that, in critical moments, his team does not support him. This not only undermines the pilot's confidence, it can destabilize internal harmony, team culture, and collective morale. Do you think McLaren did the right thing by not speaking out? Was it strategic prudence or a demonstration of weakness? Should the team change its approach and adopt a more combative stance in defense of its drivers, as Red Bull has done before? Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.